Now, God's word. We are about halfway through our exploration of the Sermon on the Mount. We are exploring the way that Jesus teaches us to live. This is the Jesus lifestyle. And it's Jesus' manifesto, in a way, for a good life, for a well life. And we are looking over this series at the way that God has designed us to be well. And it's God's desire that we are well. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus explains exactly how that can happen. Last week, Gareth brilliantly explored how Jesus didn't come to abolish the Old Testament law that all of the people that Jesus was speaking to were living by. But instead, Jesus came to fulfill it. And that's where we're headed today. We're kind of going into the nitty-gritty of what that means. What does it mean that Jesus is fulfilling the law? And at the end of the passage from last week, we heard this. This is Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, righteousness is a big term, right? Jesus is saying that our righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees, the religious leaders. But let me explain righteousness quickly. Imagine with me for a moment a community where everybody is treated with love and dignity and respect. And when there are problems that arrive or conflicts occurs, everybody works their socks off to do right by each other, even with the people that they've fallen out with. In the Bible, that way of treating each other is called living righteously, doing righteousness. And this vision of righteousness, or right living, maybe an easy way to say it, means that we and those that we live alongside can live out that desire and design of God's for us to be well. God's people gained all their knowledge about how to live right, about how to do righteousness from the law that was given to Moses in the Old Testament. And Jesus states that our righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. They were the religious leaders of the time. And as Gareth explained to us last week, that would have been a really shocking statement. The Pharisees were the experts at following that law. They were brilliant at doing the right thing. They were seen to be the ones who were basically perfect. But that is the key thing. They were seen to be perfect. Their behavior was absolutely top-notch. But what we'll see today is that Jesus cares way more about the right and well living that comes from the desires and the motivations of our hearts, not just the outward appearance of our behavior. We do see in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus cares about our behavior. He gives us really helpful instructions about how to live, but he doesn't just care about the surface. It's the motivations of our hearts that will help us to live a good life and a well life. And we know, don't we, that what's going on inside us will inform the way that we live, the way that we act to the world around us. And trying to live differently on the outside to how you feel on the inside is really difficult. It's exhausting and it's destructive. So Jesus is teaching us that starting with our hearts, asking God to transform us from the inside out, that is what will lead to a life that is flourishing and well. Jesus is teaching us that integrating our hearts with our behavior is what leads to wellness. So how do we actually do this? Jesus gives us a few case studies that we're going to go through each of them. It's the kind of, like I said, the nitty-gritty, the honest outworking of this wisdom. Now, in the passage that we're going to read today, Jesus kind of ticks off quite a lot of the big topics, really. And preachers through the years have used this passage to explore doctrines, sets of beliefs about hell, about murder, anger, marriage, sexuality. And we will speak to all of these things. But in this series, we really want to explore the themes and the teaching that are right at the heart of Jesus' words. And so even though we're going to look at 3 different case studies, this is really just a one-point sermon. Living right and being well starts within us. And from that place, it flows out of us into our lives with others. Living well and living right starts within us and flows out to our lives with others. So let's read our first case study and we'll dig in. I'm starting at Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. and anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge. The judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. There's some really big statements in there. And it can feel quite dramatic, can't it? But Jesus is doing that really deliberately, as we'll see. And in all the case studies we'll hear today, all three, you'll hear a phrase repeated. Jesus first says, "You've heard it said," and then quotes a piece of law from the Torah, from that Old Testament law that God's people live by. And then he says, "But I tell you." And he gives a kind of expanded interpretation of that law. Jesus really believes, as do I, that we can learn to live right and well by following God's wisdom. And so he says, "You've heard it said," and quotes a piece of law, and then says, "But I tell you," and reveals to us the wisdom that is underneath that command. And so in this first case study, Jesus says, "You've heard it said, do not murder." You might recognize that from the Ten Commandments. And it's as simple as that. Jesus is reiterating, do not murder, or you will be subject to judgment. And that sounds pretty reasonable to us, doesn't it? That's kind of how the law works now in 2024. We all think that's a good idea. But then Jesus takes it a little further. Anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And then further again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, the term raka basically translates as saying something like, "You empty head," or "You stupid idiot." It was a really normal term of reproach to be used in the day. And I'm an eldest daughter with two younger brothers, and so I spent basically all of 0 to 18 using the phrase "you stupid idiot" at least twice a day. But surely calling someone a fool or calling your brother a stupid idiot is not the same as murder. Really, does it deserve the fires of hell? Now, we have all sorts of connotations across this room, I'm sure, with hell. It crops up in different forms and interpretations. Maybe it conjures for you an image of kind of Dante's Inferno, whether the 14th century poem or the PlayStation video game. Maybe you think of The Good Place, the TV show, or kind of, Fire, the little red man with horns. Hell often has connotations for us with eternal consequences, and it feels like a massive statement for Jesus to make about a low-level insult like "you fool." But actually, that's not what Jesus is referring to here. The Greek word that Jesus uses here for hell is a real place. It's called Gehenna. And Gehenna is in the valley of Hinnom, which was just south of Jerusalem. And anyone that Jesus was speaking to would have known that Gehenna is the place where all the rubbish from Jerusalem would have been thrown. Anything not fit to be kept in the city would have been thrown down into that valley and burnt. It was a good way to get rid of the rubbish. And so fires were burning in this valley at the bottom of the city pretty much 24/7. People living in Jerusalem at that point didn't have the gift of council rubbish collections. And so this was a good way to keep the city clean and pleasant and safe. And so when Jesus refers to the fires of hell being the result of calling someone a fool, he's not talking about this kind of future, abstract, eternal kind of place. He's calling to mind a metaphor that is something really in the present. And Jesus is being deliberately provocative. He's trying to make a point that murder and anger and verbal abuse, even name-calling, they're all surface manifestations, outward behavior of something that is way deeper. And his point is that they all lead to a similar kind of suffering for ourselves and for others. The way deeper heart attitude that Jesus is getting at here is how we value or don't value somebody else's life. Murder would be the ultimate way of saying that somebody else's life doesn't matter. But actually, anger and name-calling, even passive aggression and snide remarks, they all reveal a kind of contempt or perhaps a grudge against someone that sits within us and doesn't value them as somebody made in the image of God. So what Jesus is saying, that any time we devalue or belittle or act aggressively towards someone, we're not doing right by them. We're not treating them as the person made in the image of God, which of course we all are. The anger that Jesus is talking about here isn't the kind of quick flash of frustration you get when you stub your toe or burn your dinner. And Jesus isn't saying, don't be angry. Note that Jesus says, when you're angry, not if you're angry or don't be angry. Jesus felt anger because there are things in our world that we should be angry about. Violence against women and girls, racially motivated hate crime and discrimination, amongst all the other things that are worth our anger. But the kind of anger that Jesus is getting at is that deep-seated grudge or contempt or feeling of superiority that can settle in our hearts when we're angry at somebody over time. That kind of anger that tells us that we're better than them anyway. And we start to devalue that person in our hearts, which flows out into our actions. So we have three choices, I think, about what we do with that anger. The first way of doing something about it is that we act on it. We let the anger dictate our actions. It builds up, and it might be that we get violent physically or with our words, whether actively or passively. Either way, this leads to a kind of death within our relationships and therefore our communities. And that is why Jesus says it leads to the fires of Gehenna. Our second option is that instead of acting in our anger, we suppress it. We internalize it and try to forget about it. But of course, anger sitting in us for that long can turn into a kind of poison. Trying to suppress it actually makes it violent to ourselves. It can make us feel surrounded by darkness, a loss of hope and energy. That also doesn't sound like the vision of the good life that Jesus is offering us. We see people who love God expressing their anger in the Bible. As I said, we see Jesus being so angry when his temple is being used for commercial gain. King David in the Old Testament, who wrote most of the Psalms, the songbook of God's people, was really good at expressing his anger. I wonder if you knew this was in the Bible. This is Psalm 109. David writes this about an enemy. Appoint someone evil to oppose my enemy. Let the accuser stand at his right hand. When he is tried, let him be found guilty, and may his prayers condemn him. May his days be few. May another take his place of leadership. May a creditor seize all he has. May strangers plunder the fruit of his labor. May no one extend kindness to him or take pity on his fatherless children. Very expressive anger. And it goes on. That was just a little excerpt. David isn't acting on his anger. He's not suppressing it, but he is expressing it to God. God can take our honesty, whether anger is morally right or wrong in any situation. Expressing it is so important. Because as David does that, he's kind of metaphorically throwing that anger into the fires of Gehenna. Whether we chat with a trusted friend or a counselor, whether it's writing your own version of a psalm, expressing our anger is vital so that we can then do our third option, which, as Jesus teaches, is to deal with the anger. Verse 23, Jesus says, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Jesus is speaking to the crowd of people in front of him just north of Galilee. And they would all know that the place to give offerings, the place to give a gift to God would be at the altar in Jerusalem. It's about a 100-mile walk from just north of Galilee to the altar in Jerusalem. And so what Jesus is saying is if you get all the way to Jerusalem and then realize that there's somebody back at home who you've got a grudge against, walk all the way home, reconcile with them, and then go all the way back to Jerusalem and leave your gift. Timings-wise, I suppose this is kind of the equivalent of flying to New Zealand, realising that you're cross with someone back in London, flying all the way back to London, reconciling, and then getting yourself back to New Zealand. It seems kind of mad, doesn't it? This is a really big statement for Jesus to make. But it shows us this is how seriously Jesus takes the destructive power of holding that contempt or anger deep in our hearts. Like the rubbish that gets thrown out into Gehenna, Jesus wants that kind of anger thrown out of our hearts. And this, Jesus tells us, is how we get the foretaste of the good life, the well life that he's preaching on. Deal with your anger radically and dramatically, Jesus tells us. Because living right and being well starts within us, and then from there it flows out of us into our lives with others. Okay, next case study. Are you ready? Move your shoulders if you need to. Plant your feet back on the ground. This is verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. More big statements. Jesus first quotes, you've heard it said, again, from the Ten Commandments, you shall not commit adultery. And of course, he's talking about adultery in the context of marriage here. Throughout the Bible, marriage is a beautiful and continuous picture of God's faithfulness to humanity. Steadfast and lifelong and committed. It's a covenant promise, a sacred promise of commitment and love. And the church, that's us, God's children, we are often referred to in the Bible as the bride of Christ. Being the bride of Christ shows us that God's commitment to each of us is to bestow us with love and dignity and value and compassion and purpose. On the other hand, adultery in the Bible is often used as a picture of humanity's unfaithfulness to God. And so it's no wonder that marriage is such a contested thing, given how important it is to God. But the wisdom that Jesus shares after this command is talking about something even deeper than just that act of adultery in marriage. Jesus is taking us again beyond the outward behavior, don't commit adultery, to a deeper truth about the nature of our hearts below that. So yes, Jesus is speaking to feelings of lust for someone outside of your marriage. But there's also a question here about what we do with our sexual desires, but also any desires. And actually, I think there's something even deeper that Jesus is saying. Underneath all of that, Jesus is teaching us about the importance of faithfulness. God's promise of faithful, committed, lifelong love is given to each of us, no matter our marital status. And so Jesus is speaking here about the heart attitudes of all of us, married or not. We can exercise faithfulness and unfaithfulness to God and to those around us. It's really worth clarifying that lust is not the same as sexual desire or attraction. These are good things. God created our bodies and God called them good. Jesus was raised on Hebrew scriptures which portrayed sex in the context of steadfast, loving commitment as good. But when we lust after someone that we're not in a relationship with, we are not able to offer that love. One way to understand lust is as wanting to claim something for ourselves that is not our own. It's a hidden thing often, and it slowly persuades us that others are there for us to take and to use in a way that pleases us. And when we do that, we start a slow mental game of dehumanizing them. It becomes easier to treat the other person as an object rather than a human being, made in the image of God and worthy of dignity. The way that we treat people around us, whether we know them or not, is a way of expressing faithfulness. Staying faithful to the image of God in each and every person, not claiming them as our own to treat however we wish. And Jesus uses a dramatic picture again, doesn't he? He's the kind of king of hyperbole. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, Jesus is not being literal. We know, don't we, that the real problem is in our hearts, not our eyes or our hands. But again, this is how seriously Jesus takes this. If our desire is driving us to objectify other people or dishonor the image of God that is found in them, if it's causing a breakdown of relationships, actually it's ruining us. And so Jesus encouraged us, do whatever it takes to deal with it. Next time you see someone attractive walking down the street, let me encourage you. Don't treat them in a way that loses their humanity. That person has dreams and wishes and ideas and anxieties just as we do. And in every situation, no matter who you come across, remind yourself and your heart that every single person we meet is a human being made in God's image. because from there our actions will flow. Are you still with me? Great. All right, our final case study. Verse 31. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. It's really important to say that Jesus here is not speaking into a modern day context. He's not speaking about divorce and marriage and remarriage in the context that we live in now. And this is not Jesus laying down the entirety of wisdom on marriage and divorce in just these few verses. Instead, he's speaking into a really specific and live debate that was going on at the time. In Jesus' day, only men could initiate divorce, and that was leading to all sorts of problems. There was an argument going on between religious leaders at the time about how to interpret a particular ancient law on divorce. Essentially, some argued that this law said that it was only permissible for a man to divorce a woman if she had committed adultery. But others argued that this same law said that a man could divorce a woman for any reason. She doesn't cook my favourite meals well enough. She isn't as funny as I'd hoped. She's a bit annoying when she's tired. Any reason at all. And this is the specific argument that Jesus is weighing in on. Because if a man could divorce a woman for any reason, it would be easier for that man to abuse the power that he held. Any divorced woman would be left without income or support and therefore would be really vulnerable. And that is exactly what Jesus is trying to avoid. Jesus' intention in this instruction is not to address the ethics of divorce, but the misuse of power by, in this case, men, to leave women as they wished. This is a really helpful paraphrase that comes from the Bible Project of Jesus' instructions. Men, stop harming women by marrying and divorcing flippantly, thinking that it's all good as long as it's legal. You might think divorce is a convenient way to clear the slate and start fresh, but that's not possible. It's brutal and painful. So what Jesus is saying is, don't use your power to treat women as you wish. That is rubbish that we don't want in our cities and we don't want it in our hearts. This is not a comment that Jesus is making on abusive marriages that are unsafe to stay in. His teaching protects women who are being used and abused. He's declaring that life in God's kingdom protects the vulnerable and ensures that everybody is treated justly. And I think because what he's teaching is something deeper than just the surface command, the responsibility for this does not just sit with the married men in the room. As ever, Jesus is getting at something much deeper. This is a heart attitude that this time relates to power, which helps us to live well and be well. We all have power of some kind. You might not feel like you have very much, but actually in the way that we spend our money, the way that we use our words speaking to and about people, the way that we use our resource and our influence, all of that gives us power. And Jesus encourages us to set our hearts in right relationship with power so that the actions that flow from that reflect God's design for us to be well. Let me give you an example that relates, I think, both to faithfulness and power, the way that we are faithful to people made in God's image, the way that we use our power. Some of you might know that in my spare time, I lead a walking tour around Whitechapel. I know it's so nerdy and I absolutely love it. This tour goes around Whitechapel and it attempts to change the narrative about the 5 women who were killed in 1888 by an unknown murderer who's widely known as Jack the Ripper. In our tour, we look at the lives of the women rather than their deaths. And we also raise awareness about the similar multiple disadvantages and stigma that are faced by women who are involved in prostitution in Tower Hamlets today. And one of the things that I say during that tour is that we are really careful about the language that we use. We're really careful about the way that we use the power of our words. When referring to the women that we support now, you will only ever hear me say a woman involved in prostitution or a woman who sells sex. And the reason that we do that is because we want to emphasize her humanity over anything else. We remind ourselves that these women are human beings with dreams and ideas, full of courage and resilience, like any of us. And this is a really simple way in which we can be faithful to God about who he says these women are. They're made in his divine image. And it helps us use our little bit of power well. The power of my words will be used to protect and honour the vulnerable, rather than being complicit in belittling or objectifying them. Let me encourage you over the rest of today and this week. What are examples in your life where you can be faithful to every human that you meet, treating them with dignity? How can you use your power to avoid being complicit in abuse of power? And more than that, as I think Jesus would say, can we let God transform our hearts so that these actions flow naturally from the inside out? The Sermon on the Mount gives us a foretaste of how it works when we are given Jesus' righteousness, when we are given the heart that Jesus had. Ultimately, we know that the bar that Jesus set right at the beginning of our time together, your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. It's too high for us to reach all of the time. And so in God's goodness, through Jesus' life and death and rising again, God promises to be the one that restores our hearts. Last week, Gareth quoted the prophet Ezekiel, who spoke God's words to his people, saying this: "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." In other words, I will transform your heart into a heart that is overflowing with peace and wholeness and justice and wellness, setting you on a trajectory for eternity in God's presence, where tears are no more and mercy and compassion reign. This is so much deeper than just our behavior. God's wisdom in these commands are aimed at our core desires and motivations. We could follow these rules perfectly, but still dishonor or objectify people because of the attitudes of our hearts. But instead, let me encourage us this morning, whether for the first or the 100th time, to turn to God, the God who promises to transform our hearts into motivations that lead to right and well living. I'd love the band to come up and join me as I finish. Living right and being well starts within us. And from there flows out of us our lives with others. Real right living, real righteousness looks like treating every human being like they have value, dealing with our anger quickly, staying faithful to who God says our brothers and sisters are, using whatever power we have to protect and serve. And Jesus says all of this because he cares about all of our holistic well-being, hearts, minds, bodies. If we valued each other really that much, imagine the kind of world that we would end up living in. Jesus' announcement about God's kingdom here on earth was meant to reshape our imaginations. God's wisdom invites us to honor the image of God in every person we meet, which is countercultural, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it is the way to holistic, flourishing life. Seeing baptisms today reminds us, doesn't it, that we have a God who welcomes us in, who calls us loved and blessed and cherished and held, who's not looking for perfect behavior, but for hearts that want to be transformed. Would you stand with me? I'm going to pray for us. God, we know that our world is not perfect. And we know that we are not perfect. But God, we know that as Jesus lays out in this sermon, as we are exploring each week, you, Jesus, have a vision for your kingdom, for your world, which is full of right living, where people are treated with dignity, where power is not abused. And God, we need your help. We need your help to be the kind of people who can usher in that kingdom. God, would you start with us? God, would you start with me? Would you transform our hearts into people who can take that dignity and mercy and love into the places that we go? Holy Spirit, come and fill us and help us. In Jesus' name, amen.